These are not just stories. They are the nights that changed neighborhoods, the whispers that made people lock their doors. Welcome to the Scariest Night Stories for 2025 that will haunt you. I say for 2025 not as a gimmick, but because this year felt like a reopening of old wounds. I spent the last 12 months collecting accounts, emails, voice memos, late-night phone calls from people across cities and towns who sent what they could remember. The fog at the shoulder of the road, the way a wooden chair moved across a courtyard, a child's laugh heard long after the child was buried. Some of these reports were brand new, arriving in my inbox this year. Others were decades old, told again in a new voice, polished by memory and the passage of time. When you put them together, when you listen to them in a single night, patterns emerge. The woman in black who shows up on lonely curves, objects that return no matter how many times they are destroyed, bargains with things that are not angels. I'll be honest up front, I don't claim proof. I never will. These are testimonies, what people say they saw, what neighbors heard, what families still whisper about when they think no one else is listening. And yet, they stick. They spread. They change how people move through the dark. Before we go any further, if you like being afraid, if you collect unsettling stories like some people collect stamps, hit subscribe. This season's collection is darker than anything I've done before, and there are pieces here that will not let you sleep easily. Roads have always been thresholds. At night, asphalt and loose gravel turn into something else, a throat, a seam, a place where the ordinary dissolves and memory floods in. The first few stories I want to tell you all come from the road, the high, wind-blasted stretches where lonesome drivers keep rhythm with their lights and their fears. A trucker wrote to me from the outskirts of Tijuana. He said he's been driving for 20 years and that the night shift pays more because the roads are emptier and the trucks move faster. That is the kind of calculation that makes people keep driving when the moon is a thin coin and the radio is just static. He told the story like this. It was a night in late May, hot enough to leave sweat beading at the back of his neck, though his cab's fan hummed. He'd been on Ruta 3, the road that cuts through the scrub, the kind of highway where the kerosene smell of long-haul dinners hangs in the cab long after you've eaten. He rounded a curve, and there she was standing by the shoulder, a woman in a black cloak, unremarkable from far away, except for a candle clutched in one hand that burned with a steady, almost windless flame. In her other hand, he could just see something pale and long, like a bone. He stopped, because you stop when you see someone on the side of the road at midnight. It's an act of decency and sometimes a calculation. He rolled his window down, the engine doing a little shudder, the highway lights painting his dashboard in pale blues. She didn't move to the truck. Her face was turned away. When he asked if she needed a ride, she didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the other hand with the bone, and he swore he felt the temperature in the cab drop 2 or 3 degrees. He said the truck would not go. He turned the key. The engine turned over and died as if the road itself had decided the truck was not welcome. He watched the flame of the candle reflect in the side mirror, and in that reflection he saw the bone more clearly, long and curved, not quite human. He slid the truck door open, thinking to pull out a flashlight to walk over and help. The gravel under his boots crunched loud as a reprimand. He took one step and looked up. The woman had vanished. Not walking, not misting away, just gone, as if someone had cut the scene away with shears. He left, slowly, as if exiting a place he'd been trespassing. At the next gas station he sat and drank coffee until dawn, hands still trembling around the styrofoam cup. He told the attendant and the attendant laughed it off, but later the trucker found a smear of grey ash on his boot, like soot that had no source. He kept a photograph of the curve in his phone and would sometimes sleep with the headlights on, he wrote. Other drivers in that route have similar stories. They call her La Mujer de la Curva, woman of the curve. Or they say something kinder, Virgen, with a whispered "de las cenizas" attached sometimes, as if her aspect changes when the story needs a name. A different voice, this one a young woman who works nights at a roadside tienda, sent a recording she could barely listen to twice. She described the late shift, the blinking fridge, the smell of coffee and stale tortillas, the hum of the cooler, the distant highway like a faint presence. One night, a woman ran into the store, soaked, her shoes covered in dirt, her face a mask of dried blood that looked like old paper. She kept repeating in voices that did not match, "I came to see the child." The assistant tried to calm her, to offer water. The woman's skin seemed to move under the light in a way that suggested a second face shifting under the first, like a shadow walking across a face. She left without buying anything, her gait mechanical, and the assistant watched her slip into the rain as if she were a marionette, tugged by invisible strings. These are not meant to be instructions. They are snapshots of how danger appears on the road, an image, a movement, a temperature change that ends a trip or starts one. There are whole networks of tales like this. Truckers who refuse certain stretches after sunset. Night attendants who keep rosaries in their cab. Drivers who count prayers under their breath because it feels less like superstition than a small portable shield. The roadside apparitions are the oldest kind of ghost story, limit cases where the ordinary and the uncanny meet briefly and then separate. They are also where community memory first gets sewn into the landscape. A curve becomes more than a curve. It becomes a mark on the map that people avoid. In my research this year, I found at least a dozen versions of the woman with the candle and the bone scattered across cities like beads. The details shift. Sometimes she holds a doll, sometimes a skull, but the emotional pattern is the same. A frozen engine, the sudden absence of any passing light, an imprint on the driver that lasts longer than the trip. Stay with me. If you like this kind of thing, if you collect these moments like breadcrumbs, I'll have more road tales coming. But for now, let's shift from highways to the other kind of night where terror walks in. The quiet town gatherings that think themselves safe, the circus that arrives once a year. I heard a short, terrifying submission from a man who grew up in a small town that celebrated its fair with a traveling circus every summer. He remembers the clowns because they never laughed. They were the kind of clowns that favor silence, with white faces painted in such stillness you could mistake them for mannequins. They performed for a week, moving through town with tall, soundless parades, their hands folded, their eyes watching. It gave the event a strange pall, like a funeral with balloons. A neighbor started a cruel game. Some kids had dared each other, and in a bar, the neighbor repeated a rumor he'd heard. "Say the Lord's Prayer near one of the clowns," they said, "and you'll make something happen." The bar fell quiet because one does not test prayers like a trick. But someone laughed, tried it out of ego or superstition, and the man who said the prayer fell ill, suddenly feeble, whispering that the clown had whispered back. After that, small accidents piled up. A man's toy puppets that used to be treasured were found broken into queer new configurations. Whispers of footsteps at night. A woman who swore a clown sat at her table in the kitchen the entire night, unmoving. The neighborhood's songs turned to silence. One evening, a person was attacked, details I will not recount in the graphic. The aftermath ended with a conviction, someone sent to prison, and the circus, like a cloud after rain, moved on. People said the clowns had returned years later to look at what had been done in their absence, and that those who had mocked prayers learned too late that curiosity in the wrong setting can be its own kind of sacrilege. If that tale suggests anything, it's this. Small cruelties tend to be the tinder for greater fires. Which brings me to Sandro. Sandro's name comes up in nearly every neighborhood recollection I collected this year. He is, in these reports, more of a presence than a person, an emblem of how communities can fail the very people they fear. He was described as a man without a fixed home, someone who slept among abandoned frames of houses and beneath sagging roofs in the old part of a town where workshops closed and children learned to step over broken tiles. People called him a loner, a man who lingered near the square in winter, who ate what he could find, who had a habit of collecting scraps and aligning them on a plank like offerings. Some people said he'd been a carpenter once. Others said he lost his wife and never recovered. Everyone agreed on one thing: he was not violent by choice. Here is what a neighbor told me this spring. I met her name only in a voice memo she sent. She called herself Anna, or that is the name she used for the message. She lived a block from the lot Sandro preferred. When she was a girl, she'd watch him at dawn straighten nails and stack wood. He would hum sometimes, and the kids would toss him bread. As she grew up and moved away, she kept an eye on the lot out of habit. She returned in 2025 because old houses call their past residents back. The lot, an empty rectangle of earth behind a shuttered carpentry shop, had become a place people avoided. They left offerings there sometimes: a bottle of soda, a plastic flower, an image of the Virgin wrapped in cellophane and tied with a black ribbon. They called that particular depiction La Virgen de las Cenizas, Virgin of the Ashes, not because it had been burned necessarily, but because it was always found with a smudge of dirt or some strange residue, like something had been at it with its hands. On the night the message writer remembered best, kids dared each other to go to the lot. The bravest brought flashlights. From the street, you could see a figure crouched by the plank where Sandro used to keep his things. It looked like a person tending a little altar. The children hid and watched, and a neighbor whispered across the fence that was probably just Sandro. Someone said to ring the priest, and the idea of calling the priest made the grown-ups nervous because priests meant explanations people were not ready to hear. Later that night, the lot caught fire. People woke to the smell of burning wood and ash and the small, acrid tang of something chemical that clung to hair and clothes. By morning, the plank where Sandro had stacked his accretions was charred and collapsed, and the outline of a body was said to be in the middle of the blackness. Anna's voice in the message broke when she said the children still insisted they saw the Virgen standing over the plank, face turned toward the sky. They swore the image looked more like a skull than a kindly mother, its eyes empty but watching. There are two ways neighborhoods tell stories like this. One is practical and sharp. Someone stacked flammables, someone's cigarette, an accident. This is the kind of version the police report begins to formalize with numbers. The other way neighborhoods tell it is softer, more careful, because grief loves metaphors, and because calling something a ghost is sometimes a way to keep guilt at bay. In that telling, Sandro's fire was not an accident. It was a visitation. It was a judgment. It was something that the neighborhood had allowed to be set up and then turned its face from. A few listeners pushed against the idea that Sandro had sought to harm himself or had been suicidal. They said he was often seen smiling at stray dogs, feeding the pigeons, saying a word or two to toddlers. He was also reported to have started leaving small wooden crosses at corners, thin, hand-carved things that people argued about when they found them in their yards. Some took them down as superstition, others hung them in their rooms. Listen to how the voices shift in these messages. One neighbor called the plank an altar. Another insisted it was just a place to keep his tools. Children said they saw a tall woman with a skull face that walked over flames unburnt. Teenagers dared each other to touch the edge of the lot and came back with singed eyebrows and stories that were honored like medals. The town priest, contacted reluctantly, told the mother of one of the boys not to let children alone near the lot and suggested a novena, 9-day prayer vigil, for the peace of those involved. People lit candles and wrote their names on slips of paper. They left food. They said prayers. They also spread rumors, the kind that move faster than flames themselves, that the Virgen de las Cenizas had been disturbed, that what had been burned could never be properly burned, that what was burned in the wrong way returns. I will not go into detail about the way Sandro's death was described in some messages. The rule I keep with these stories is to report the impact, how the community remembers the event, the silence that followed, the ways people stopped using the lot, but not to linger on the mechanical horror. What I can tell you is that the lot became taboo. The children's games avoided it. The dogs refused to cross the street at night, and the old men at the corner cafe would not look at it when they talked. The town had, in a single night, redefined an axis of fear. There's an additional thread that has been present in reports like Sandro's, a figure many people call the Virgen de las Cenizas, which functions like a fulcrum for a set of images. Sometimes she is a protector who appears soot-streaked to care for those left behind by misfortune. Other times, she is a figure of accusation, a presence that points out the sins of a town in the sharp way ash clings to fabric. That ambiguity is essential. The stories resist a single interpretation because human need resists it. People want both a protector and an explanation for the inexplicable. After the lot burned, an older neighbor named Luis left a voice note that I listened to 4 times before I could transcribe it without shaking. He had the cadence of someone who has told the same story so many times that the edges have smoothed. But when he reached the part about Sandro, he flinched. He talked about the smell of burnt sugar that night, the way the children kept repeating the nursery rhyme that always makes him think of small things circling danger. He described a dog, Negro they called it, who had been the grandparents' guardian, who refused to leave the fence and howled like someone asking permission to enter heaven. The dog's howls, he said, were not of pain, but of insistence. People in his family stopped sweeping the sidewalk in front of the lot for reasons they could not articulate. They left a plastic statue of the Virgen with a tiny cigarette butt tucked into the base. Stories like the one about Sandro reveal more than the supernatural. They show how communities negotiate culpability. Who failed him? Who left the plank of wood unswept? Was the priest's novena enough? Were prayers enough? People wrote to me this year because these questions do not comfort them. That is why these stories keep surfacing in 2025, because new details arrive in old mailboxes, because someone moved back and found an object misplaced that suggested something was not finished. If you are listening in a city, you might have a lot similar to this somewhere. A forgotten patch of earth, a rumor about a man judged harshly a long time ago. These are not just local curiosities. They are the architecture of how we remember our failures and our tenderness. They claim the night and force us to reckon with what we do to each other when we are most tired. A different kind of memory came in from the mountain roads, from a place called La Rumorosa, a ridge where wind and stone conspire to make night a living thing. Children who grew up there told me about a witch of the stones, a creature trapped between slabs that looks at you with goat legs and refuses to be understood by adults. One listener, a woman who now lives in the city but spent summers at her grandparents' home near the pass, remembers walking a path with the cousins and hearing a sound like a goat's hooves sliding over rock even though no animal was in sight. They found a small pile of bones near a stone outcrop, like the remains of an old offering. When the grandmother saw it, she covered it with her shawl and whispered something in Spanish that the woman didn't want to repeat on the message. The grandmother told the children not to speak of what they saw. Children, of course, cannot be trusted with silence. Years later, as adults, they confessed to each other and wondered if keeping it secret had been worse than telling. These mountain stories carry a different quality from the roadside apparitions and the town fires. They are landscape-bound. They make the rock itself complicit. Being near La Rumorosa at night is being placed inside a throat that can swallow a person whole. The witch trapped between stones is a myth of the land that explains why paths shift and people vanish from sight. It marks the limit between family stories meant for children and the older, more urgent rules that adults whisper to one another to keep children alive. Sometimes, in the middle of these mountain tales, you find a small human detail that pierces through the threat. A grandmother's hand tracing the arc of a face, a child's head tucked into a shawl. These are the white threads in the dark fabric of the narrative, the reasons why stories are told and retold. Between these heavier recollections, I also collected small, uncanny moments, the kind that slide under your skin and then refuse to leave. A man in Coyoacan wrote about delivering furniture, a European-style virgin, hands folded, eyes downcast. He and a co-worker carried her into a house whose walls smelled faintly of citrus and old wood. The lady of the house thanked them and asked them to place the statue on a chair in the corner. When they returned to the truck to fetch other pieces, the worker who had stayed inside swore the virgin's head had turned. He described how the housekeeper had wrapped a thick black scarf around the statue and chained it to the chair with a length of rope, as if securing a guest who could not be left alone. Who would possess whom? Who protects whom? In the notes he sent me, he was unsure whether fatigue had made him see a movement, or whether something in the house had asserted its will. These small items, furniture that moves, statues wrapped and chained, chairs that refuse to stay put, form a quiet catalogue of uncanny domestic life. They are the pieces of superstition that sit between a family's daily routines and their fear of the night. People add salt in their windows, they fold rosaries into pocket lint, they leave incense burning low. These acts are gentle, human attempts to keep an enemy at the border. There is a pattern across these road and neighborhood tales. Boundaries are gestures we perform every night to keep the world stable. A roll of the window, a prayer muttered under the breath, a statue chained to a chair. These are rites as practical as they are spiritual. They do not always work. Sometimes the world leaks in. That leakage is what these stories are about. You'll notice that I have not passed judgment on the witnesses. I haven't called them liars. I haven't suggested mass hysteria as the only explanation. Instead, I tried to hear the shape of grief in their words. That is the curator's job, to hold the testimony gently and report the contours. We're only a few tales in, and the night has already shown us several faces. Protectors that are ambiguous, clowns who do not laugh, men who become symbols. Tonight's collection moves towards darker territory. There are other voices I need to bring you. A prayer leader who came back scratched from a spiritual journey. The boy named Ulysses who loved the milpa and then stopped returning home. The Jane that settled near a vecindad and rearranged lives. All these threads converge in a different kind of neighborhood tension where family bargains go wrong, where something taken to secure a child returns like a debt. But before I follow that knot, I want to tell you one more short roadside story, because it circles back to the theme of modernity meeting old fear. A bus driver who ferried people between towns in central Mexico, an older woman named Marta, she wrote, said that one night, coming back from a shift, she saw a poster tacked to a telephone pole at the park. A pale man with white hair and an odd hat, bent as if through age, with a caption that warned people not to make direct eye contact if they saw him. It sounded like a joke to her at first, a prank flyer. But later that night at a bus stop, two teenagers told her about an old man who had sat across from them and kept watching them in a way that made their hair stand up. They said they felt different around him, as if their shoulders had gone colder. Marta later saw him too, sitting at the end of an alley. But when she and a colleague approached to offer help, the man crawled away on hands that seemed too long and too narrow, like the limbs of something built for narrow spaces. Moments like these travel fast in urban areas. Flyers get posted, families forward screenshots, whole neighborhoods alter their habits. It becomes impossible not to feel watched. We've spent a lot of time on roads and on the borders between public and private. We've met La Mujer de la Curva, silent clowns, Sandro's Lot, La Rumorosa, a moving virgin. Each of these tales came to me as a small packet of human fear sent in 2025, A year in which old tales found new mouths. People sent them because they needed someone to hold the memory and say, "I heard you, I kept it." That is why I am telling them. There is so much more to follow tonight. Doña Lupita and the story of spirit travel that left marks on her skin. Ulysses and the dog that stayed beyond death. A vecindad whispering about a Jane, and the long story about Elvia, the pact, the child, the chair that moved, and the object that was burned and came back. Elvia's account is the one that pulled at me the most this year because it stitches together bargaining, grief, and the high cost of asking for what you cannot be given. But for now, before we move deeper into those accounts, think of what we've already heard as a map. The roads are the first tracks, the neighborhoods are the settlements, the mountains are the edge. Each place has its own taste of fear and its own rituals for dealing with it. People respond with prayer, with avoidance, with small protective gestures. And sometimes, the gestures are not enough. The next time I come back to these stories, I'll carry you into the courtyard and through the flames of a lot, into the novena circle where a woman's spirit travels and returns scratched, and into a schoolyard where a child named Ulysses is remembered in ways that refuse tidy closure. These stories are not resolved. They resist tidy endings because they are not just events. They are the ongoing business of memory. In 2025, these memories found new mouths. Tonight, let the wind be your companion and the lights in your home your small, fragile thing. The road is longer than it seems, and the dark has room for more than one shape. The courtyard waits in a kind of breathless hush. Low walls, a chipped fountain that no longer runs, the smell of burnt sugar and copal that clings to the sleeves of anyone who sits too long. It was in a courtyard like that that I first heard Doña Lupita's story, the one about the night she left her body and came back with scratches no one could explain. A woman who leads a novena is a particular kind of person in a neighborhood, someone who can staple together grief and give it shape, someone whose hands know the right rhythm to hold a candle while a whole block leans in. Doña Lupita ran a novena in a church basement every Wednesday. She knew prayers, yes, but she also knew the old songs that women hum when they want a room to soften. People came to her not just because they believed, but because human problems require human focus. A fever the doctor cannot tame, a child who stopped talking, a husband who shoved his pain down until it cracked. The night she left, the circle was full. I've transcribed her account from a voice message sent this year, and what she says is both plain and terrible. The room smelled of boiled coffee and the steady burn of several dozen candles. Someone was stirring a pot of mole in the back, and the sound was that steady domestic percussion that makes you forget for a second that you are at the edge of something. They had been praying for a woman in Iztapalapa. She had collapsed, and none of the doctors could find what was wrong. They lit the novena and prayed for her soul to be returned from whatever had taken hold. Doña Lupita told her friends that she would go out to find the cause. That phrase, go out, meant different things to different people in the room. To some it meant she would walk and ask the saints to intercede. To others it meant the quiet work of a curandera, herbs, chants, and the placement of blessed objects. To a few, with older nervousness, it meant something riskier. She would undertake a spiritual journey, a travel of the soul to look into the places where illness hides. She sat cross-legged on the floor, palms up. Someone began the Our Father softly, and the cadence of the room folded into a single breath. What she describes next is not theatrical. She does not claim glory. She says she felt a tug like a wire tightening at the base of her skull, and then a vacuum as if the air had left her body. She remembers the ground dropping away and the smell changing, no longer mole and coffee, but a damp mineral churning, the smell of a cave that has been sealed with the breath of the dead. She says she saw, somewhere far from the parish, a space like a collapsed house of women. Rows of veiled figures sitting in the dark, faces covered, their mouths closed. She remembers the panic that the figures could not see her, but seemed to feel the warmth she carried, and then a sudden slide. a corridor of stone, a living cave that swallowed light. Doña Lupita came back into her body mid-prayer. When she opened her eyes, she was sweating, and her hands were scraped as if she had dragged them over a rough wall. There were red lines on her forearms and a slender scrape across the side of her neck that bled for a little while despite their prayers. She would not say exactly what she had seen in the cave, only that there were women who existed there like waiting rooms for lost things. The priest suggested rest. Others suggested confession, but some things cannot be fixed with a rosary. A local bruja, whom observers speak of in the kind of tone used for people who both help and frighten their neighbors, came to see Doña Lupita after the novena and told her plainly that there are doors you can open with prayer and doors you open by mistake. The bruja's warning was not cinematic. It was practical. Do not return alone. Do not try again to travel without a circle. If you must go, go with other hands gripping yours. Stories like Doña Lupita's are tricky because they mix devotion and danger in a way that looks like contradiction. The same act, prayer, can be an act of protection, or the way you find the place you thought only a curandera could reach. People wrote to me this year because Doña Lupita's scratches would not fade, and because weeks after the novena, another woman in a different parish reported a similar wound after claiming a night of walking toward the same dark place. Patterns once noticed make people uneasy. There are quieter ghosts than the caves and the clanging apparitions on the highway. There are ghosts shaped like corrugated metal and yellowed textbooks, ghosts that return to a teacher's memory the way a hymn returns to a tune you thought you had forgotten. Ulysses was one of those quiet ghosts. Ulysses loved the milpa. If the town had a small field of corn behind the school, he could be found there at dusk. A boy with knees stubbornly dirty, counting the rows of corn as if they were a secret language. His dog, an honest mongrel whose name the neighborhood called like a blessing, would follow him and wait by the small gate while Ulysses ran small errands for his mother. The first tales I received about him came from a teacher who could not bear to send the memory away. The teacher, she signed her Audio Mariana in the message, said that one autumn the boy did not come to school. He had been to the milpa that morning and then not to class. His family thought he had wandered to play with cousins. They called neighbors. They looked in alleys. That afternoon the neighborhood quieted itself in the way that suggests a collective, slow breath. People put down cups, stopped sweeping, and began to look out windows. Eventually, they found his body a little way off the path, between two rows of corn, a small thing turned still. What happened next is the part that lives in the schoolyard. After Ulysses's funeral, children swore he came back at dusk. A pair of small footprints would appear on the blackboard chalk tray in a shape that no shoe could leave. A faint guilt smell of milpa would seep into the classroom at the end of the day. The dog, the same one who had kept watch while Ulysses ran errands, took to wandering the fence and sitting by the spot where the boy had been found. The dog would not leave the schoolyard, and some reported would sometimes refuse food. Parents started to lock the gates earlier. Older kids told initiations that if you walked by the milpa at night and sang Ulysses's favorite rhyme, you could hear a child laughing in a voice like wind through stalks. I spoke via voicemail with Richie. He calls himself Richie, and in the message he says he was a cousin of Ulysses because I wanted to hear what grief sounds like when it is not neatly wrapped. Richie's voice got quiet when he talked about the first time he saw the boy after the funeral. He was 13 then, and he swore he saw Ulysses on the path, picking at corn silk with a slow, tired motion. Richie shouted for him because a child does not look the same when they are only a memory. The boy turned and looked at him, eyes wet, and for a second Richie thought, and said to me over the phone with the stammer of someone still reliving, he could feel the air around his throat like someone had sighed down his neck. The vision faded as if someone took away the scenery. Richie swore he ran back to his house and slammed every door. There are families that treat these returns like a blessing. There are families that treat them like an annoyance. In the case of Ulysses, the community treated the boy's presence like an open wound. They fed him in little ways, left a small bread roll at the milper gate now and then. A teacher left an extra notebook on the desk. A neighbor hung a small painted wooden star on the fence. The dog, the guardian, wouldn't be coaxed away. Children who had once shrugged at the spot now sang a prayer each morning. The story is not one of horror in the flash and scream sense. It is a sustained ache that changes the choreography of a neighborhood. If some tales make you tuck your head in at night, others make your skin crawl simply because they suggest the ordinary household is not wholly domestic. The man who carried furniture in Coyoacan told me about a deliver of a European-style virgin. Heavy, carved hands, eyes downcast, paint glossy as varnish. The house smelled of citrus and cleaning oil. The woman who owned the home was precise and anxious. She told the delivery men to place the statue on a chair and to return for the rest of the pieces. One worker, who stayed to guide the furniture into the truck, said on his recording later that when he came back, the statue was turned. He could not be sure. It could have been fatigue, the play of light, the squeak of wood that fooled him. Yet the housekeeper did not laugh. She wrapped a thick black scarf around the statue's shoulders and secured it to the chair with a chain. The metal clinked in the air like something apologizing. For weeks after, the neighbors said the curtains would move even when the window was closed. Objects like that arrive in messages to me more than any other kind of tale. A burned plank returns to a yard in the middle of the night. A virgin statue cries wax tears. A chair rocks by itself. People try to remove these things. Sometimes they burn them, sometimes they bury them, sometimes they drive nails into them. Often those attempts fail, either because the object reappears or because some household member begins to dream of it in such vivid detail that they know where it is hiding. All of which raises a quiet and terrible question. Who belongs to whom in the house at night? A whole neighborhood's equilibrium can hinge on a small thing. In one vecindad I spoke with, a family took to sleeping in shifts because they were sure an item, a talisman left by a visiting relative, had attached itself to the child's bed. They consulted priests and curanderas. They sprinkled holy water and recited psalms. They wrapped the talisman in cloth and buried it for a month. When they dug it up, it had a scratch across it like a fingernail. Their daughter began to speak in words she had never learned. Who can claim victory in such situations? The family learned to live with uncertainty. That, more than anything else, is why these stories persist. Sometimes what arrives in a neighborhood is not an object, but a presence seeded by moving people. Newcomers, refugees, strangers who bring practices and prayers that do not match the patterns of the old neighborhood. I received a message this spring from a man who lived near a vecindad that had recently housed a few refugee families. The man described a night when the house behind his was full of strange noises that did not belong to the city. Fluting at odd hours, the sound of a language the man did not know, a kettle that sang in half notes. He and his neighbors assumed the new residents meant no harm. But a few nights later there were strange scratches at the base of the courtyard doors and a whispering like the murmuring of a small animal at dusk. The priest recommended sprinkling holy water and banners. An older neighbor suggested asking a bruja. The disturbances stopped after a week of shared prayers and offerings, and the man who wrote to me added this caveat. There was never any evidence the newcomers had intended harm. More likely, it was a mingling of practices that produced an uneasy, unfamiliar soundscape. I tell you that because it matters. Urban centers are increasingly places of exchange, and sometimes the spiritual baggage that moves with people is more misunderstood than dangerous. Listeners in 2025 sent messages asking me to take care not to turn such tales into excuses for fear of the other. I have tried to honor that request by being careful with the language I use. These are the reports of neighbors who felt threatened. They are not indictments of whole populations. Often the simplest acts, someone explaining a prayer, a night spent in company, eased tensions. Sometimes it did not. Across the same year, though, the city spun an edgier story. The pale man with white hair and a small hat who appeared on posters, who would be seen sitting alone on a bench or crawling where no adult should crawl. The posters themselves were a kind of folklore. They were a practical form of rumor. If you see him, do not make eye contact. I collected at least half a dozen accounts about him. Each one altered his shape. One friend I took to the park with me when I was younger swore she saw a bent old man, and then, moments later, a figure folding up like a paper spider. An older couple insisted he sat like a harmless vagabond and offered a soft song. Teenagers took videos and then deleted them because the footage showed a smear where a face ought to be. Flyers used humor to mask fear. They used blunt language to say, "Something in the city is watching." When my own friend Anna and I saw him, it felt small and large at once. He sat at the edge of the park bench, wrapped in a coat despite the evening warmth. From one angle, he looked like any older man who had fallen asleep in the park. From another, he looked like a thing being studied by the light. Anna swore he turned his head too many times in a way that was not human. I remember the way the smell around him changed, something metallic, like a coin pressed against a wet paper. We left and did not look back, and later we found that our memory differed sharply. She said he had crawled away on hands that seemed too long. I said he had melted into the wall like shadow. That is the way urban legends eat at themselves. Witnesses take a common event and shape it into a creature that fits their fear. All of these accounts, Doña Lupita's cave, Ulysses's milpa, the moving virgin, the Jane in the vecindad, the pale man in the park, come together to form a certain architecture of fear. They are rooms in a house we all share. Some rooms are lit and warm, others are shuttered and leak cold through the seams. But nothing in this season of stories haunted me as much as the case of Elvia. Elvia's story occupies space differently because it is not fully supernatural in the theater sense. It is deeply human, threaded with desire and grief. When she first wrote to me this year, she wrote with a steadiness that made the paper edges of the tale sting. She said the word packed plainly, and then she spent 10 pages describing how it arrived. Elvia and Norberto had been married for many years. They tried for a child for a long time and suffered through the medical appointments, the whispered limitations of biology, the polite condolences from others who didn't know how to say anything. Much of what I received in those months was devoted to the small domestic textures of their life. Norberto's work shirt creased at the elbow, Elvia's habit of setting 2 cups of coffee and forgetting the second one on the stove. These are the ordinary details that make grief feel real. You can name it, you can find where it sits. When you lose the future you planned, you carry the present under a kind of permanent ache. According to the messages I was sent, Elvia reached a point where the city's medical explanations had stretched thin. She wrote about a night when a man she described as an angel, though she hesitated at the word because the word publicizes what she wanted to keep private, appeared in the courtyard while she wept by the sink. He was not a figure of robes and halos. He was a presence with a soft voice that offered her a bargain in the hush of a household already surrendered to midnight. It would not be a cheap bargain. She would bear a child, but some debt would be owed in return. She accepted. The story as she tells it is not theatrical. It is the record of a woman burned out by longing. She says the angel's breath smelled like dusted oranges and burned paper. Norberto, busy with work the night the man spoke, slept through it. She became pregnant 2 months later. The family celebrated in a small private way. Neighbors brought casseroles, a priest came once to offer a blessing, and Elvia kept a little shawl folded in her bedside table that smelled like lavender. The baby was born late on a humid evening, alive for days that stretched like blades. People said the baby's cry did not match its size. Elvia remembered in a message that the child's breathing sometimes seemed to pause and then come back like someone trying to catch up with a silence. They named him, and the family believed the bargain had been worth the cost. It did not end there. The infant died in a way that people reported with gentle discretion. He simply grew still. The family had a funeral, small and private. Grief rearranged the furniture of their house. They wrapped the baby's shawl around a chair and left it by the window. Elvia would set a cup out on the table like an offering and then forget it for hours. Norberto retreated into the long hours of a job. The neighbors said the house's shadows grew thicker and that chairs in the back room began to move in small motions, like something nudging a place set at the table. Objects that had been ordinary, spoons, a wooden plank, a cheap child's toy, showed up in different rooms the next day. Once, someone found the little wooden plank Elvia's husband used in repair work, charred and black, as if it had been burned, though the workshop showed no sign of fire. That plank, the thing some messages called a guija, others called an altar board, became a kind of character in the story. It was an object they had used for ordinary work that somehow attained a malign persistency. Elvia and Norberto decided to burn it in a ritual one night when grief and fear had gotten too close. They carried it out to the lot behind their house. Neighbors gathered at a distance. Someone offered a prayer. A priest did not come. They set it alight. The plank collapsed into ash. They slept without nightmares that night, they said. In the morning, the plank was on the kitchen table. I know how that sentence reads in your head, because it reads in mine the same way. Small and plain, then monstrous, simply because it is defiant. Neighbors reported that whoever looked upon the plank felt a pressure at their chest, like the slow tightening of a band. The family tried to destroy it again. They hammered metal through it. They submerged it in water. They buried it deep. Each time it returned, sometimes nicked and sometimes pristine, like something that could not be reduced to matter. As the months went by, Norberto grew ill in ways that neither the clinic nor the priest could name. He stopped leaving the house for his job. He sat in a chair by the window and watched the street as if he were measuring the lines of the houses. A friend of his, who had a small medical practice, told me in a voice note that Norberto's blood work looked ordinary. No pathogens, no clear diagnostic marker. But the man writhed when the family played a lullaby, and his sleep was full of shivers and a mouth that moved as if singing a song only he could hear. Elvia changed, but not in the theatrical sense. She grew thinner, perhaps because grief takes a particular kind of energy. She began to write notes with predictions, small lines of time she said she had seen in the space between tears. She predicted an illness. She predicted the color of a particular sun at the hour she would die. She predicted the reappearance of the plank on a day when no one expected it. The neighbors who recorded these events insisted she was not seeking attention. Her predictiveness, they said, was sad and real, like someone who knows how bad a storm will be because she has seen its wake. The case drew outsiders. A psychologist named Alicia took an active interest because of what she described as clinical curiosity, a family in acute grief whose symptoms blurred into each other in ways that challenged neat categorization. Alicia interviewed the family, took notes, and in some of the recordings she sent me, she sounded near to believing and near to despair at the same time. She suggested that grief could produce experiences that feel wholly real without being paranormal. And she also admitted in private notes that sometimes reports defied easy explanation. There were nights Alicia sat at the kitchen table and felt something like the pressure others described, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Elvia's prediction of her own death came 2 years after the child's funeral. She had said once, in a line that sounds dreadful in the retelling, that some debts were not paid in currency, but in years. She joked at times, darkly, about the ledger of a life. The date she mentioned arrived quietly, not with lightning or sign, but with a sleep that did not return. She died on the date she had written in a note left on the mantel. The neighbors who found her described the silence in the room like a held hand. Norberto's illness continued until, some months later, he stopped eating with any interest in making coffee the way he used to. He lingered for a while, and then he, too, was gone. If you hear this and think of bargains in fairy tales, small favors that require a cost, you are not far off. Except the fairy tale feels wrong because it sanitizes the human price. Elvia was, in every account, a person who wanted a common future more than anything else. The bargain, then, is not a morality play about greed. It is a portrait of desperation and a caution about how grief can be coaxed into agreement with something that will not allow itself to be paid off. After Elvia's death, the household continued to be troubled by small movements and larger silences. The plank returned, as it always did. Neighbors started to leave lit candles outside the house at night. The family, what remained of it, kept the house, but avoided the back room where the plank would show up. A priest came and blessed the threshold again and again. A bruja came too and performed rites that promised to contain but not to solve. The town split into opinion camps. Some said the house should be emptied and the furniture burned on a high pyre, with a priest and a bruja both watching. Others said those were cruel solutions for people licking their wounds. The case became, in 2025, something larger than the family. I found a dozen testimonies from neighbors and 2 long emails from a retired investigator who had been on the scene in 2023 when the initial incidents took place. The investigator, Alicia, worked with him sometimes, kept a file that included audio of creaks at night, photos of the plank in different rooms, and notes from family members. He had kept the case open because there were details that frustrated closure. The plank's recurrence, the way the family reported a lullaby in 2 keys, the way Elvia's handwriting altered on the last notes she wrote. He could not put a label on the events, and because he could not, the case became a kind of emblem. Something an open wound refuses to let heal. I do not offer a solution. I am telling you what was reported. The ethical tendency here is to name the unknown as such, to hold both the human pain and the strangeness without collapsing either into the other. In Elvia's story, the supernatural is not an ornament. It arrives like a consequence of a very human desire. Stories like Elvia's are the reason people in neighborhoods sometimes ask, not for an explanation, but for company. They ask that you listen. That is how these tales keep living. Someone carries them home, repeats them to a friend, posts an old photograph with a trembling caption. In 2025, as I collected these accounts, Elvia's case returned to my inbox more than any other. New witnesses added small observations. A neighbor who had moved away in 2019 saw in a social media post that the family had been photographed with an unusual shadow in the doorway. A cousin wrote to say the family's old rosary had a bead missing. The files accumulate. The community continues to circle the house in the way a mother circles a sleeping child, part vigil, part careful watch. When I read through the Elvia material, I felt the thread that links the whole set of 2025 stories. A parish, a milpa, a highway curve, a lonely trucker, a novena circle, a pale man in a park, a moving statue. What ties them is the economy of community, the way neighbors tend to each other, and how, when something strange happens, they mobilize with what they have. Prayers, brujas, a priest, a psychologist, a burned plank. The supernatural in these reports is not so much an external antagonist as a social event. It produces behaviors. It reshapes the weeks, the small rituals of a place. People adjust. They alter their lives. They whisper certain names. I want to pause and tell you something important I learned in the months of collecting these voices. Grief and the uncanny are not evenly distributed. The people who told me their stories for 2025, the truckers, the teachers, the novena leaders, made their confessions because they needed their memory to be heard. Some sent voice memos they could barely listen to again. Others typed 2 lines and left the rest in silence. In many of these accounts, neighbors appear as both saviors and failures. The same community that brings candles to a doorstep can also be the one that shuts up and looks away. There is an archival impulse at work in nights like these. People preserve a thing, an object, a prayer, a name, so that the thing does not vanish in the easy way memory does. They pass it on. They try to explain it to someone who will not mock them and who will not turn the tragedy into a sermon. That is part of why I make these episodes, to hold the testimonies, to translate when necessary, to keep their cadence intact. I am not a judge. I am a listener. By the time you hear this, by the time this episode archives somewhere on a server and someone scrolls through paperbacks of our stories, they will be part of 2025's folklore. Why 2025? Because the year felt like a confluence. New submissions resurfaced, anniversaries met with fresh details, and social media allowed a rumor to become a neighborhood's law in 3 mornings. It is not that the world changed overnight. It is that people started speaking more openly about things they had previously hidden, and the collection of those speakings made a strange year of it. I do not want to leave you only with questions that rattle in the ribs. There are small, practical compassion acts threaded through these accounts. A priest lighting an extra candle, a neighbor sitting with a mother until dawn, a teacher leaving a notebook where a child once used to sit. The human thread is what persists. The dog guarding the fence at the milpa, the novena leader who returned with scratches, the trucker who keeps the headlights on. If you are hearing this and you have your own story, if there is a woman in your town who appears at the curve of a road, or a plank that won't stay destroyed, or a child who visits after funeral hours, please send it. We collect them not to fuel fear, but to preserve witness. I have promised to keep sharing these accounts with respect and care. In the show notes you'll find a way to submit a recording or a short note. I read everything. The book I mentioned earlier takes some of these tales and turns them into fictionalized stories with permission from those who told them. The link in the notes will take you there if you want a deeper dive. Tonight's collection began on the road and ended, for me, in a house that will not let go. It moved through caves and circuses, through dusted corn and moving statues. It asked how communities respond when the border between the everyday and the uncanny thins. The answer is never tidy. People gather candles, call priests, summon brujas. They move furniture. They post flyers. They sleep with lights on and with prayers muttered like talismans. And sometimes, despite everything, the thing returns. When I close my notebook on these stories, I always imagine their sound as a set of small waves. Some are sharp and high, others roll and sponge into quiet. They do not announce themselves at once. They arrive one by one through the mail, over messages, by word in a plaza. They build, and in 2025 they stacked into a kind of pile that we could not ignore. If you want to keep listening, if these nights interest you in the way an old photograph might, consider subscribing so you don't miss future collections. I will keep holding these voices, and if you choose to send yours, I will hold that one too. There is one last detail I cannot help but tell you, because it follows the logic of the stories like a shadow. In the last file I received about Elvia, a neighbor recorded the kitchen at dusk. The audio is thin and full of the small creaks of a house settling into its bones. At the end of the clip, after a lullaby-like noise fades, you can hear, very faintly, a plank being set down on a table. It is the ordinary sound of wood on wood. Then you hear a chair scrape. Then silence. Keep the lights on if that helps. If you go out at night, remember the roads are thresholds and that sometimes a woman with a candle is only a woman. Other times she is not. Either way, the night keeps its shapes, and the stories keep getting passed along. When they arrive, they do not just tell us about ghosts, they tell us about ourselves. Thank you for listening. If you live through a night like the ones I've described, or you remember an old tale that keeps someone in your barrio up at night, send it in. There is a place in the notes where you can do that, and the book link is there if you want a fictional expansion. Until next time, keep a small light by the window. These are the scariest night stories for 2025, and they will not leave you quickly.